All right, y'all. Hey, what's up, good people on QC? Welcome back to another Talking and Grubbing live nightly digital show. Well, it's morning, but this is a special live nightly digital show. How's everybody doing this morning? I hope everybody's doing good. I'm doing good. I had to end my live last night because I had something take care of something personal. But now I'm back. Today is Super Bowl Sunday. I know everybody's excited. We're all getting ready to see the Patriots and Seahawks go at it in Super Bowl 60. As one of them hopes to walk away with the Lombardi. It would be the second title for the Seahawks, while it would be a record-setting seventh title for the Patriots. Definitely want to know who you got in the Super Bowl. Let me know in the chat. If you're watching on YouTube, vote in the poll. All right, so this is part 2 of my more top 10 GOAT Super Bowl champions. Here we go. At number 5, I have the 1997 Denver Broncos. Now, the Broncos, they had been to multiple Super Bowls in the John Elway era, but they either always came up short or got downright shellacked. Elway was entering the twilight of his career. And he definitely wanted to end his career as a champion before he walked off into the sunset. And the Broncos finally felt like they had a team that could get over the hump. Of course, they already had Shannon Sharpe, the tight end, the superstar running back in Terrell Davis. But in the 1997 NFL draft, the Broncos found a steal in Trevor Price out of Clemson, defensive tackle, to shore up an already top 5 defense. He just made them better. And in the 1997 season, the goal for the Broncos was to finally get over the hump and win the Super Bowl. And in the regular season, they got off to a very dominant start as they went 6-0 going into the bye week. Now, the second half of the season, they had their struggles. They lost some couple of major divisional games to the Raiders and the Chiefs. But they still managed to win their final 6 games. They finished with a 12-4 record. They finished a game short of the AFC West title as the Kansas City Chiefs won the division title. Well, the AFC West that year. They had Pro Bowlers in Shannon Sharpe, as well as Terrell Davis and Elway. Also, center Tom Nalen. But of course, the Broncos, anchored by head coach Mike Shanahan, had a very prolific offense. During the regular season, they finished top 10 in every offensive category. They were first in offense, averaging 367 yards per game. They were ninth in passing yards, averaging 218 passing yards per game. They were fourth in rushing, averaging 148 rushing yards per game. They were fourth in passing TDs as they finished with 27 passing touchdowns, which averaged out to 2.6 passing touchdowns per game. They were fifth in rushing touchdowns as they finished with 18 rushing touchdowns, which averaged to 1.2 rushing touchdowns per game. And they were first in points as they averaged 29 points per game. Like I had just mentioned, they also had a great defense. with the with Trevor Price, as well as the Hall of Famer Steve Atwater. And they were top 10 in almost every defensive category. They were 5th in defense, giving up 291 yards per game. They were 5th in pass defense, giving up 291 passing yards per game. But they were 16th in rush defense, giving up 112 rushing yards per game. They were 6th in points allowed, giving up only 17 points per game. They finished 10th in sacks, where they ended up with 44 sacks, averaged out to 2.75 sacks per game. And they were 9th in takeaways, as they created 31 takeaways. So this Broncos team was definitely stacked on both sides of the ball. Now they went into the postseason, ready to finally silence the doubters and get over that hump. And it started in the wild card round. In the wild card round, they dominated the Jacksonville Jaguars 42-17. And now they advanced to the divisional round, and one of their biggest AFC West rivals stood in the way between them and the AFC Championship, and that was the Kansas City Chiefs, who were the number 1 seed in the AFC. Now, this was a hard-fought game between these two rivals. The Broncos, they had a 7-0 lead at the half, but then in the third quarter, the Chiefs scored 10 unanswered points, to have a 10-7 lead. But then the Broncos came back in the fourth quarter to take the lead and ultimately ended up winning 14-10 in Kansas City to advance to the AFC Championship game. And then another team stood in their way, the Pittsburgh Steelers, who were the number 2 seed. So the Broncos had to go into Pittsburgh to take on a tough Steelers team that dominated the regular season in order to advance to the Super Bowl. And the Broncos started out this AFC Championship game very dominant. They led, 24-7 at the half. But of course, the Steelers, the team that they rallied to close the gap within 3. But the Broncos, they ended up holding off the tough Steelers and got a 24-21 win in Pittsburgh to advance to their first Super Bowl since 1994. And now finally, one more game stood between them and capturing that elusive Lombardi trophy. They will have to go through another great team and another Hall of Famer in the Green Bay Packers with Brett Favre, the welfare king, in Super Bowl 32, as the Packers were looking to repeat as Super Bowl champs. And this game definitely was going to be a very close battle, as both these teams were great. You had 2 all-time great quarterbacks on each sideline. First quarter, game was tied at 7. Then the Broncos, they took a 17-7 lead at halftime. But of course, with the Packers, with all that talent on offense, with Favre, Antonio Freeman, they definitely came back, definitely made a comeback here in the second half. They got it to single digits, but the Broncos were determined. Elway and crew wouldn't be denied. And they ended up getting the 31-24 win to win their first Super Bowl title, to finally get that monkey off their back that had haunted them for over a decade, losing all those Super Bowls. John Elway ended up winning his first title. Terrell Davis was named Super Bowl MVP, rightfully so, as he had a monster game. I have to trying to find his stats now. He had 30 carries for 157 yards and 3 touchdowns. John Elway was pretty pedestrian, as he had 12 completions on 22 attempts, 123 yards, 0 touchdowns, an interception, and only a 51 QBR rating. And also, there was some records set in this Super Bowl. Most rushing touchdowns in the Super Bowl, which was by Terrell Davis. Also, most points scored in a game, which was by Terrell Davis also, as he had 18. Also, most interceptions thrown by a quarterback in his whole Super Bowl career, which was Elway. He had 7 picks. Also, the Broncos tied a rushing touchdown record in the Super Bowl with 4. As also John Elway, rushed for a touchdown himself. But the Broncos finally got their redemption and became Super Bowl champs. Now, I picked this team at number 5 because it's underrated that the run they went on to get to the Super Bowl. Of course, they had their home game against the Jaguars. They dominated, but they had to take on the number 1 and the number 2 teams in the AFC on the road in order to get to the Super Bowl. And they won some pretty close games against those 2 teams. In fact, against the Chiefs in the divisional round, the Broncos had to come back from a deficit to win. And also, they had to hold off a Pittsburgh team that had just been to the Super Bowl. Well, they had been to the Super Bowl a few seasons earlier. Also, people forget how underrated this team was. This team had talent all across the board. Of course, we know about Elway, Shannon Sharp, and Terrell Davis, but also you had Mark Schlereth, who's become a prominent NFL analyst. He was one of the best old linemen in the game. Also, you had Ed McCaffrey at wide receiver. That's the daddy of Christian McCaffrey. Plus, on the defensive side of the ball, you had dudes like Darren Gordon, Ray Crockett, Keith Traylor, So this defense was no joke. And also, this team definitely also, was 12-4. Plus, they also don't get credit for just how dominant they were on both sides of the ball. This team was definitely dominant. And matter of fact, almost ended up having a top 3 seed in the AFC if they wouldn't have lost a few games during the regular season. Plus, this was John Elway's masterpiece. This definitely was. He finally got over that hump and became a Super Bowl champion. And this was the cherry on top for his career. He was already a Hall of Famer, but this really solidified him into legendary status. And plus, this Broncos team definitely should have gotten more appreciation as far as Super Bowl champions than it has. Now, a lot of people definitely elevate that 98 team, and that 98 team was very prolific and dominant. Matter of fact, last year I had them in my top 10 of GOAT Super Bowl champions, but this team was the team that started it all, and they definitely should be more appreciated. All right. Yeah, I see somebody in the chat. Bum Block, what's up, man? Good morning. He said first Super Bowl since 1989. Chargers won AFC in 1994. What's cracking, TNG? What's up, Blue? What's up, man? How you been? Thanks for joining me on this Super Bowl Sunday morning. I'm doing good. All right. 6 down, 4 more to go. So let's keep this show going. At number 4, oh, my bad. Wrong clip. At number 4, I have the 1990 New York Giants. The New York Giants in 1990 were trying to win their second Super Bowl in 4 years. They felt like they finally had the team to do it. But unfortunately, fate would conspire against them as they ended up losing Pro Bowl quarterback Phil Simms to a season-ending injury. So they would have to rely on veteran quarterback Jeff Hostetler, who was almost about to hang it up. He was very close to retirement when the Giants gave him the call to start at QB. And no one knew what to expect. And no one knew what to expect from Hostetler. No one knew if he could at least lead the team. Of course, they knew he wasn't going to be a Phil Simms, but they didn't know if he was going to lead the team, if the team was going to be successful, or if the team was going to win. So they really had to rely on their run game and running back Otis Anderson. So they went to the 1990 season, and they were dominant. Thanks to a large part thanks largely to their defense. Man, the Giants, they won 10 straight games to start off the 1990 season. Like I said, they were dominant thanks to the defense and run game. Now, in late November, early December, they lost 3 games. Big important games to the Eagles, 49ers, and Bills. But they won 3 more. They ended up finishing 13-3, winning the NFC East, getting the second seed in the NFC. Now, the Giants didn't have too much offensively. As they finished almost in the middle of the pack in every offensive category. They were 17th in offense, averaging 300 yards per game. They were 22nd in passing, averaging 172 passing yards per game, but they were 8th in rushing, averaging 128 rushing yards per game. They were 17th in passing TDs, only finishing with 18 passing touchdowns, which averaged out to 1.1 passing touchdowns per game. But they were 7th in rushing touchdowns, which they finished with 17 rushing touchdowns, which averaged to 1 rushing touchdown per game. And they finished 15th in points, averaging 20 points per game. Now, of course, they were dominant defensively, thanks to Lawrence Taylor and Pepper Johnson. But they finished in the middle of the pack in almost every defensive category. They were 17th in defense, giving up 300 yards per game. They were 22nd in pass defense, giving up 172 yards per game. They were 8th in rushing defense, giving up only 128 rushing yards per game. They were 15th in points allowed, giving up 20 points per game. They finished 24th in sacks, giving up 30. Well, no, finishing with 30 sacks, excuse me, which they averaged 1.8 sacks per game. But they were 8th in takeaways, which they created 34 takeaways. All right, so the Giants rolled into the playoffs strong, hoping to get back to the Super Bowl and win it. And they were about to see if Hochstetler could lead the team. Now they had a first round bye, but they ended up dominating the Chicago Bears in the divisional round, 31-3, and they were on to the NFC Championship game with a huge test. They had to go on the road in San Francisco to take on the 49ers. The 49ers were coming off of back-to-back Super Bowl titles, and they were looking for the three-peat. And this NFC Championship game was definitely a grind-out game. It wasn't pretty. Seemed like neither team could really get any offense going, as both teams had some major turnovers. But Hochstetler led a drive late in the fourth quarter that ended up getting the Giants into field goal range to try to advance to their first Super Bowl since '86. Hochstetler completed passes to Bavario and Baker. They ended up getting them into field goal range. Matt Barr came on and knocked through a 42-yard field goal as time expired, and the Giants advanced to the Super Bowl for the first time since 1986. Now in the Super Bowl, they were taking on the Buffalo Bills, who are definitely having a great season as well as a great playoffs. So this was a battle of two New York State teams in this Super Bowl, and only one could walk away with the Lombardi. Now, this game, for the most part, was back and forth between these two teams. You knew it was going to be. Right, Giants started off leading with the 28-yard field goal, but then the Bills, they just went on a little fury, and they led 12-3 in the second quarter, but the Giants responded with some points of their own, especially in the second half, as Otis Anderson scored the go-ahead touchdown, but the Bills wouldn't be denied. Thurman Thomas came back with a 31-yard touchdown as they took a 19-17 lead early in the fourth quarter. But Jeff Hochstetler, who had just went on a game-winning drive in the NFC Championship game against the 49ers, my bad, drove them down the field, and Barr knocked a 21-yard field goal through to give the Giants a 20-19 lead. But on the other side, still had Jim Kelly, and as well as Thurman Thomas and all those other dudes. And Jim Kelly, late in the game, drove down the field with some great precision. He was finding all kinds of receivers down the field, and the Bills were on the doorstep of knocking off the Giants and winning the Super Bowl. They had Scott Norwood, who was one of the best kickers in the NFL during that time, on to attempt a field goal to win it. And it definitely looked like that it was going to happen, but the field goal ended up going wide right, and the Giants held off a tough Bills team to win their second Super Bowl in 4 years, their second Super Bowl in franchise history. That was the second Super Bowl title for LT and Bill Parcells. And that missed field goal for Norwood still lives in Super Bowl infamy. Otis Thomas was named Super Bowl MVP. Matter of fact, he is either one of the oldest or the oldest Super Bowl MVP ever, as he had a monster game. He finished with 102 yards on 21 carries and a touchdown. Jeff Hostetler, he was pretty solid. He finished with 20 completions on 32 attempts for 222 yards, a touchdown, and a 93.5 QBR rating. Now, the Giants receiving core was pretty solid. Mark Ingram had 5 receptions on 7 targets for 74 yards. And this Super Bowl team was basically a Cinderella story. That's why I have them here at number 4. This Giants team in 1990 were definitely huge underdogs, especially after Phil Simms went down. A lot of people thought that an older Jeff Hostetler could not lead the team to a winning season, let alone a Super Bowl title. Some people thought that the Giants should just pack it up and just wait till next year. But thanks to a great game plan by Parcells and Bill Belichick and that whole coaching staff, they leaned on the running game and Anderson, as well as their defense led by Lawrence Taylor and Pepper Johnson. And they ended up getting the job done. They dominated the regular season, winning 10 straight. Then in the playoffs, they showed that they could win a dominant game, or they could win some ugly white knuckle, drag out, grind out games. Because the Super Bowl, the NFC Championship and the Super Bowl were just that, grind out games. This wasn't those games were not pretty. They were gritty. And they were very close from start to finish. Plus, also, Otis Anderson doesn't get credit for the season he had. He finished with over 1,000 yards. Also, 8 rushing touchdowns. Let me make sure that's correct. Well, he finished with 700 rushing yards, but still 11 rushing touchdowns. That was the previous season he finished with 1,000 yards. My bad. But this team definitely deserves a lot more props for what they accomplished in that 1999 season, doing it with a backup quarterback who was past his prime, and also doing this with a running back that was past his prime in a lot of people's eyes. Both of them ended up rewriting the stories of their careers, and they ended up Super Bowl champions. All right, see somebody else in the chat. You said they should have been the number 1 seed there. This is my dude, Blue Boat. Said they should have been the number 1 seed in the NFC that year. You also said that secondary was underrated too. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the Giants definitely had an underrated secondary. Yeah, you had Mark Collins, Everson Wells, as well as Greg Jackson. But a lot of people focused on that front, and that front was pretty doggone good. Like I mentioned, LT as well as Pepper Johnson, but you also had Carl Banks, Gary Reasons in that front line. Just that whole 1990 Giants team is underrated. All right. At number 3, I have the 2017 Philadelphia Eagles. Now, the Eagles, coming into the 2017 season, they were definitely primed to win the Super Bowl. They had retooled their team, and they definitely had the team that definitely could win the Super Bowl. They had Carson Wentz, who was ascended into a superstar in the NFL. Also, they had a great defense that was anchored by dudes like Malcolm Jenkins, as well as Fletcher Cox, who I think was underrated and should have got more props than what he did. But also, they had a great offensive line anchored by the center Jason Kelce, the right tackle Lane Johnson. Also had a tight end in Zach Ertz. And also, they made some upgrades during the offseason, signing veteran wide receivers at Alshon Jeffrey, as well as Super Bowl champion Torrey Smith, as well as another Super Bowl champ in Chris Long. Yes, he's the son of Hall of Famer Howie Long. And also Long's running mate from New England and LeGarrette Blount, the running back. So the Eagles definitely were very primed to win a Super Bowl with the moves that they made and also the draft picks that they acquired. In 2000 regular season, they were off to a very dominant start as they won 8 out of their first 9 games heading into the bye week. And they had a lot of dominating wins. And they looked like that they were definitely headed towards a very dominant season. Carson Wentz was looking like an MVP candidate. Matter of fact, he was one of the favorites to win MVP that year. But unfortunately, the game of football ends up rearing its ugly head as Carson Wentz suffered a season-ending injury on the road against the Rams in Week 14, and they had to rely on on Nick Foles, the veteran backup QB who had been on many stops during his NFL career. But in spite of that, they didn't miss a beat. They won their last 2 out of 3 games to finish 13-3. They won the NFC East crown, and they had the number 1 seed in the NFC. And they were definitely firing on all cylinders on offense as they finished 7th in offense, averaging 365 yards per game. They finished 13th in passing, averaging 233 passing yards per game. They finished 3rd in rushing, averaging 132 rushing yards per game. They finished 1st in passing touchdowns, which they had 38 passing touchdowns, averaged out to 2.3 passing touchdowns per game. They finished 24th in rushing touchdowns, which they had nine rushing touchdowns, which averaged out to 1 point rushing touchdowns per game. and they finished third in points, which they averaged 28 points per game. But they also had a pretty dominant defense that was anchored by Malcolm Jenkins, who had won a Super Bowl with the Saints, and also Fletcher Cox. They finished top 10 in almost every defensive category. They were fourth in defense, which they gave up only 306 yards per game, but they were seventh in pass defense, giving up 227 passing yards per game. But they were first in rush defense, giving up only a whopping 79 rushing yards per game. They were fourth in points allowed, giving up only 18 points per game. But they finished 15th in sacks, which they ended up with 38 sacks, which averaged out to 2.3 sacks per game. And they finished fourth in takeaways, which they created 31 takeaways. Now, heading into the playoffs, a lot of people had their apprehensions about the Eagles due to the fact that they were rolling into the playoffs with a journeyman quarterback. They were wondering if Foles could definitely lead this team to a Super Bowl appearance, or would he fold under the lights? Now, of course, the Eagles had the first round bye due to them being the number 1 seed. And in the divisional round, they took on the Atlanta Falcons. And this was a hard-fought game. As a matter of fact, it came down to the wire. The Falcons definitely were definitely a pesky team. They definitely didn't quit. Of course, they were just in the Super Bowl the year before, and we all know what happened in the Super Bowl. But the Falcons, they started off with a 10-0 lead. But then the Eagles went on to score 15 unanswered points, and the Eagles held off the Falcons for a 15-10 win, as the Falcons were in position right at the goal line to win it, and Ryan's pass to Julio Jones went incomplete. And now they advanced to the NFC Championship game to play the Minnesota Vikings. The Vikings, they were coming off a hard-fought win in the divisional round, thanks to that was now dubbed as the Minneapolis Miracle, as Stephon Diggs got a hell of a pass to the end zone against the Saints, as they won it with as time expired. But the Eagles would go on to dominate the Vikings for a 38-7 win and make it back to the Super Bowl for the first time, since the 2005 season. And a former adversary stood in their way between them and the Lombardi, and that's the New England Patriots. The New England Patriots had beaten Donovan McNabb, T.O., and that Eagles team in the Super Bowl a few years before. But the Eagles were looking for redemption, and also you had a couple of former Patriots in Long and Blount who wanted to get payback by beating their former team in the Super Bowl and get rings of their own and get another ring outside of Tom Brady and the Patriots. And they were massive underdogs in this Super Bowl due to the fact that Nick Foles was the starting quarterback, and they were going against Tom Brady and the Patriots, who were a dynasty, who had just won the Super Bowl the previous year, looking for the repeat. But the Eagles definitely weren't intimidated. In fact, they embraced the challenge. And they came into the Super Bowl. Well, they started the Super Bowl firing on all cylinders. In fact, by the second quarter, they had a 22-9 lead on the Patriots, and the Eagles were just firing on all cylinders in that Super Bowl. Thanks to one of the most iconic trick plays in Super Bowl history, the Philly special. I'm about to show it to you now. Now, this was a play that they had ran in practice earlier that week. They hadn't ran this play all year, and Doug Peterson made a very gutsy call to run it. Here we go. As the pass was made to Foles in the end zone from Trey Burton to Nick Foles for a touchdown to extend the lead for the Eagles. Right, there we go. My apologies. But that was a gutsy call right there by Doug Peterson and his coaching staff. As I mentioned, they had only practiced that play the week of the Super Bowl. They had never practiced it all season. And Peterson decided to pull out the Philly special here in the Super Bowl, and it paid off. And it's one of the most iconic plays in Super Bowl history. But of course, you got Tom Brady on the other side of that, on the other sideline, and the Patriots would come back with 14 unanswered points here in the third quarter, and then a touchdown in the fourth quarter made it a single-digit game. And it looked like the Patriots were driving down the field to take the lead, but the fumble, it was Brandon Graham with the sack fumble on Brady that ended up sealing the game. That ended up basically sealing the game for the Eagles as Foles drove down the field. It led to a field goal by Elliott that extended the lead for the Eagles, and the Eagles ended up holding off the Patriots to win their first Super Bowl in franchise history. They have finally got the monkey off their back after dealing with so many playoff failures as well as Super Bowl failures. The Eagles finally got it done, and they were crowned Super Bowl champs. LeGarrette Blount and Chris Long ended up getting their Super Bowl ring, ended up winning their Super Bowl title outside of the Patriots. So they definitely proved to everyone that they made the right decision by leaving a dynasty in the Patriots and going off to Philly. Nick Foles was named Super Bowl MVP, rightfully so, as he had a monster game. He finished with 373 yards, 3 touchdowns, an interception, a receiving touchdown with a 106 QBR rating. Also, LeGarrette Blount, he had a great game. He had 14 carries for 90 yards and a touchdown. Nelson Aguilar, he finished with 84 yards. But Corey Clement, he had a monster game. He finished with 100 yards and a touchdown. Also, Alshon Jeffrey had 73 yards and a touchdown. This was just a dominating performance by Nick Foles, as Nick Foles, after all these years of being a journeyman quarterback, finally got his opportunity to play in the Super Bowl, and he took full advantage of it. And not only he showed up, he showed out. But this Eagles team got this ranking because how underrated their run was. Also, they were huge underdogs for the rest of the season and in the playoffs, and as well as in the Super Bowl. No one thought that the Eagles would win it with Nick Foles, who had been on various teams throughout his whole career, hadn't had much success, but the Eagles team and the Eagles coaching staff believed in him, and he definitely rewarded their belief by having a dominant playoff run and having some pretty good games to close out the season. And he stepped up on the biggest stage, which was the Super Bowl, and delivered in more ways than one. Also, the Eagles defense definitely doesn't get the props they deserve either, because, man, they had some dudes on that defense. Had Malcolm Jenkins, Fletcher Cox, Brandon Ingram. In my opinion, Fletcher Cox is very underrated. Chris Long was pretty good, as well as Corey Graham, Jalen Mills, the corner, Ronald Darby. Both of them were a hell of a cornerback duo. Also, the Eagles definitely just don't get the props for the run they had, especially with a backup QB. It's very rare that a team wins the Super Bowl with a backup quarterback. Very rare. And that was the first time since Jeff Hostetler led the Giants to the Super Bowl title that a backup QB led a team to the Super Bowl. So I think the 2017 Eagles, should be appreciated a lot more for what they accomplished, especially under some tremendous odds after they lost Carson Wentz for the rest of the season. All right, 2 more to go. Which teams will it be? You'll find out. I'll be right back, so don't go away. All right, I'm back, good people. My apologies. Had some technical issues I had to take care of on my end. All right, let's keep it going. At number 2, I have the 2007 New York Giants. Now, the Giants, they definitely felt like they had a team that was ready to compete and win the Super Bowl, but they kept coming up short in the playoffs the last couple of years. But in 2007, they finally felt like they had the team that could go out and not only compete, but ultimately win the Super Bowl. They had a pretty nice draft as they drafted Steve Smith, the wide receiver out of USC, as well as Zach Diossi, the linebacker out of Brown. Also, they were able to maintain their core as they brought back center Sean O'Hara. Also, Ryan Keel. Hope I said his name right. If I mispronounced it, I apologize. The center. So they didn't really do too much in the offseason. They felt like they had the right team to compete and win the Super Bowl. Of course, Michael Strahan definitely wanted to end his already Hall of Fame career with a Super Bowl title. He had been there 7 years prior, but his team ended up being dominated and shellacked by the Baltimore Ravens in Super Bowl 35. But he felt like this was finally his chance to break through and get that elusive Super Bowl title. And the Giants came into the 2007 season ready to show the world that they can win the Super Bowl, but kind of got off to a rocky start as they went 0-2 with losses to the Dallas Cowboys and the Green Bay Packers. But they picked it up and they went on a 6-game winning streak heading into the bye week, especially with some big wins over division rivals, the Washington Redskins and the Philadelphia Eagles. But coming off of the bye, they definitely stumbled again by losing to the Cowboys at home coming out of the bye. Matter of fact, they were dominated by the Cowboys. But they still won 4-7 to finish the regular season. Now, they had a tough loss at home to the New England Patriots, a very hard fought loss that came down to the wire. But the Patriots would survive 38-35 in the final regular season game at home to cap off a perfect regular season at 16-0. So the Giants finished 10-6. They were second in the NFC East, and they had the fifth seed in the NFC. Now the Giants, my apologies. Now the Giants definitely had some pretty good, were solid on the offensive end. They finished 17th in total offense, averaging 326 yards per game. They were 23rd in passing, averaging 198 passing yards per game. They were 6th in rushing. They averaged 128 rushing yards per game. They were 14th in passing touchdowns, only finishing with 23 passing touchdowns, which averaged out to 1.5 passing touchdowns per game. They were 7th in rushing touchdowns, which they finished with 15 rushing touchdowns, which averaged to 1.0 rushing touchdowns per game. And they were 14th in points, which they averaged 23 points per game. Now, they had a pretty good defense that was anchored by the Hall of Famer Michael Strahan, as well as Usi Umenyiora, who I thought was underrated. They were 7th in defense, giving up only 305 yards per game. They were 11th in pass defense, giving up 207 passing yards per game. They were 8th in rush defense, giving up 97 rushing yards per game. They were 17th in points allowed, giving up 21 points per game. They were 4th in sacks, which they finished with 53 sacks, averaged out to 3.3 sacks per game, but they were only 22nd in takeaways as they created 25 takeaways. The Giants came into the playoffs huge underdogs. Well, not huge underdogs, but they were underdogs due to the fact they had their past postseason failures, but they were out to prove everyone wrong, as the wild card round had been their Achilles heel the last few years. But this time, it wouldn't be an Achilles heel, as they had to go on the road for all their playoff games. And they went on the road to Tampa Bay, dominated the Tampa Bay Buccaneers 24-14. And now they were on to the divisional round against the vaunted Dallas Cowboys, who had swept them during the regular season. They were in Dallas, which was Texas Stadium at the time. So, of course, that was a very hostile crowd. But for the most part, the Giants definitely weren't intimidated. Matter of fact, they started off dominant. They had a 14-0 lead. They started off with a 7-0 lead, but the Cowboys answered with 14 points to take a 14-7 lead. Then they led 17-7 in the third quarter, but the Giants stormed back with 7 points of their own, and they ended up getting a 21-17 win. So they finally broke the streak against the Cowboys, as the Giants sealed it with a interception by McQuarters in the final seconds to seal the win and to punch their ticket to the NFC Championship game, as they would go into the frozen tundra that is Lambeau Field in Green Bay. And in this NFC Championship game, it definitely lived up to its name. It was almost 0 degrees in that NFC Championship game. It was about, 2 degrees at kickoff, and it was cold throughout the night. But there was a lot of heat and action on the field between these two teams, as this was a very close game. Also, there was kicking struggles. Lawrence Tynes had missed 2 field goals early in the game. So the game went into overtime, and it looked like Brett Favre, the welfare king, and the Packers were going to drive down the field for a game-winning field goal. But the Giants had other plans as the ball was intercepted early in overtime by Corey Webster at midfield. Make sure I have the name right. Yep, Corey Webster, the cornerback with the interception at midfield. And Eli drove the Giants down the field. And this time, and it was up to Lawrence Tynes again to make the kick that would send the Giants to the Super Bowl. And he kicked a 47-yard field goal attempt to send the Giants to the Super Bowl as they won 23-20 in overtime, their first Super Bowl appearance since 2000. So the Giants, they called themselves Road Warriors, and they lived up to their name because they ended up winning all 3 playoff games on the road to get to the Super Bowl. Now, they had one more nemesis, and this was a big nemesis too, that was standing between them and their 3rd Super Bowl title, the undefeated New England Patriots. Of course, the Patriots, they finished the regular season 16-0, and they had a very dominant playoff run as well. And they were looking to cap it off with a Super Bowl win to cap off their perfect season. And it definitely looked like they were in position to do that early on as they took a 10-3 lead in the second quarter. And at halftime, looks like, and the Giants definitely couldn't get anything going offensively. Well, my bad, it was 7-3 at halftime, not 10-3. My apologies. But Tom Brady led a game scoring drive that gave the Patriots, extended the Patriots lead in the fourth quarter. But the Giants, they wouldn't go away quietly. Eli Manning was ready to show and prove that he was the man in the moment as they had scored a touchdown to make it a 4-point game, forced the Patriots into a 3-and-out, and it was Eli Manning's turn. Now, Manning on 3rd down, looks like he was in trouble. Looks like he was about to get sacked, but he was very crafty in eluding the sack. His O-line bought him some time, and in a very ballsy move, he threw the ball way down the field to David Tyree. Tyree made the classic helmet catch between 2 Patriots defenders and still held on to the ball as he went down for a huge first down to keep the drive alive for the Giants. That's still one of the most iconic plays in Super Bowl history. And Eli was not done. He ended up finding Plexico Burress in the back of the end zone for the touchdown. And the Giants ended up going ahead 17-14. But of course, with about a minute left to go, you still have Tom Brady on that other sideline. Brady was driving down the field, finding various receivers, getting first downs all over the place. And he had time for one more Hail Mary. And Brady threw it up in the air, and the pass was batted down, and the Giants ended up pulling off one of the biggest upsets in Super Bowl history. They ended up capturing their 3rd Super Bowl title, their first since 1990, their first under Tom Coughlin. And the Giants finally exercised some postseason demons and proved to everyone that they were worthy of delivering in the clutch and winning the Super Bowl. Eli Manning was named Super Bowl MVP, and he had a pretty good game. He finished with 19 completions on 34 attempts for 255 yards, 2 touchdowns, an interception on an 87.3 QBR rating. Amani Toomer, he finished with 84 yards. David Tyree, he had 43, including a touchdown, 43 yards, including a touchdown. Plexico Burrs only had 27 yards and just the game-winning touchdown. Ahmad Bradshaw and Brandon Jacobs, they combined for 87 rushing yards. Also, this capped off Michael Strahan's Hall of Fame career as he finally broke through and won the Super Bowl. And he walked off into the sunset after that. But this Giants team, they were definitely an underdog story, one of the greatest underdog stories ever, and one of the most underrated seasons ever. Now, they definitely had their stumbles along the way, especially in that second half. But you could see that they were really coming together in that second half. They almost ended up, handing the Patriots their first loss of the regular season. Also, they proved to the whole world that they could go on the road and win huge playoff games. They were the David that took down Goliath in the Super Bowl for one of the biggest upsets in Super Bowl history. And also, people forget how talented the Giants were. Not just on offense, but defense as well. Of course, we had Strahan. You also had Human, but also you had dudes like, you had Corey Webster. You also had Antonio Pierce. People forget how underrated he was in that Super Bowl run. So you had talent on both sides of the ball. Plus, this team definitely should definitely should get a lot more flowers than what they do. Yeah, they get their flowers for the Super Bowl, but they don't get their flowers for the team that they had that won the Super Bowl. This team was definitely talented, and you can see why they ended up winning the Super Bowl. And plus, their season should definitely be highlighted more than what it is. That's why I have the Giants here at number 2. All right, we got one more left. You're going to find out who I have as the number 1 Super Bowl champion. You'll find out when I come back, so don't go away. All right, I'm back, good people. My apologies. Was having some technical issues due to this winter weather up here in the Northeast. All right. The moment you've all been waiting for. The number one Super Bowl champion is, drum roll please, the 1987 Washington Redskins. Now, the 1987 NFL season was a season unlike any other. The NFL players and the players union in the NFL were at a standstill on on a new collective bargaining agreement. They wanted better wages, also more flexibility in free agency, as well as better pensions. And the owners wouldn't budge. So after week 3 of the NFL season, the NFL players went on strike. So teams from all across the NFL, they ended up getting replacement players, guys who had either played only college ball, never got into the NFL, or some players who played in the NFL previously but were cut, or some played in the CFL. They were just getting guys from all over. And the Redskins were no exception. They had replacement players such as Tony Robinson at quarterback, Anthony Allen at wide receiver, also Allen Harvin at running back, as well as Ricky Johnson, Craig McEwen at tight end. So these players were, those players as well as many others were on the 87 Redskins practice squad. And they ended up getting some very key wins. During that time, they ended up going to New York, stunning the Giants, who were the defending Super Bowl champs at the time. Matter of fact, not just stunning them, they dominated them 38-12. Also, they won against the Cowboys in Dallas on Monday Night Football 13-7. And they got a very close win against the New York Jets. They came from behind to win 17-16. And then after that, the regular Redskins, as well as all the players in the NFL, crossed the line as the strike was affecting their pockets. So they all came back to their jobs, and the replacement players were shown the door once again. The only replacement player that ended up staying for the remainder of the season was Anthony Allen. But once the Redskins regular players returned, they had their struggles, but they went on to win 5 out of 8 games to finish the regular season at 11-4 with the NFC East crown, as well as the number 1 seed. No, excuse me. They ended up finishing with the 3rd seed in the NFC. Now, the Redskins, they were definitely dominant on both sides of the ball. What's going on here? Okay, there we go. My apologies. As Doug Williams, definitely did a great job as he had to replace Mark Rippon, who ended up having a season-ending injury. And the Redskins definitely didn't miss a beat with him under center. They were top 10 in every offensive category. They finished third in total offense, averaging 373 yards per game. They finished fourth in passing, averaging 233 passing yards per game. They finished seventh in rushing, averaging 140 rushing yards per game. They were fourth in passing touchdowns. They finished with 27 passing touchdowns, which averaged out to 1.8 passing touchdowns per game. They finished third in rushing touchdowns, finished with 18 rushing TDs, averaging 1.2 rushing touchdowns per game. And they also finished fifth in points, averaging 25 points per game. Now, along with Doug Williams, he also had wide receiver, the All-Pro, Gary Clark. But the Redskins had a pretty great defense as well that gets underrated by a lot of people. They had the Hall of Famer Darrell Green, as well as Charles Mann, the All-Pro, as well as Dexter Manley, and the other cornerback, Barry Wilborn. And they finished top 10 in almost every defensive category. They were 18th in defense. They gave up 334 yards per game. They were 24th in pass defense, giving up 222 passing yards per game. They were 10th in rush defense, giving up 111 rushing yards per game. They were 6th in points allowed, only giving up 19 points per game. They finished 4th in sacks, which they ended up with 53 sacks. That averaged out to 3.5 sacks per game. And they were only 16th in takeaways, which they only created 34 takeaways. All right, so the Redskins had a tough road ahead in the playoffs as they were the third seed. If they wanted to get back to the Super Bowl and win it, in the wild card, they had a bye because back then there was only 5 teams instead of 7 like there is today. But in the divisional round, they went on the road in Chicago against the Bears. They won a very close game, 21-7. Then they ended up hosting a home game in the NFC Championship game against the Minnesota Vikings, who were definitely having a hot playoff run as well. And they had to also fight tooth and nail with them in a real close game as the Redskins held off the Vikings 17-10 to advance to their 4th Super Bowl in 5 years. No, excuse me. Their 4th Super Bowl in 6 years. And they were having a remarkable season as well as a remarkable playoff run as they won with Doug Williams as the backup QB and also the replacement players. And they were going up against the Denver Broncos in Super Bowl 22. As Elway and the Broncos had a pretty dominant playoff run, and they were trying to finally break through and win the Super Bowl after losing it the previous year to the Giants. But the Redskins and Doug Williams, they came out firing on all cylinders after Denver had taken a 10-0 lead in the first quarter. It was all Redskins from there. Matter of fact, in the second quarter, they scored 35 points. That is still the most in a quarter in Super Bowl history. Let me make sure I'm right. Yep. That is the most points scored in the first half in Super Bowl history, as well as the most points scored in any quarter in the Super Bowl. Man, Doug Williams was just a beast, firing that ball all the way down the field, finding various open receivers. And then in the fourth quarter, he put the Redskins put the icing on the cake with another touchdown as they dominated the Broncos in Super Bowl 22, 42-10, to win their second Super Bowl in franchise history. That was, if I said third Super Bowl title, that's my mistake. It was only their second Super Bowl title in franchise history, which they had won 5 years prior. And they won it in dominant fashion thanks to Doug Williams. Doug Williams was named Super Bowl MVP. He finished with 340 yards, 4 touchdowns, an interception, with a 127 QBR rating. But Jimmy Smith also stole the show with 22 carries, 204 rushing yards, and 2 touchdowns. Also, Ricky Sanders balled out with 9 receptions on 11 targets for 193 yards and 2 touchdowns. And he caught an 80-yard pass from Doug Williams. So the Redskins definitely dominated the Super Bowl from start to finish and walked away Super Bowl champions. Now with the replacement players, of course, like I said, they ended up being cut. But the replacement players didn't get Super Bowl rings because, the ownership and the front office felt that it would have been too expensive to give out all those rings to the replacement players. And they also did a 30 for 30 on the Redskins replacement players back in 2018 called Year of the Scab, which was a great documentary. You really got it. It really got into the inside of those players, what their experiences were like playing in the NFL and what it felt like after they ended up being cut from the team and how they were slighted out of not getting Super Bowl rings. Now, the crazy part about it was they were allowed to buy tickets to the Super Bowl that they were a part of. Well, for the team that they had played for, if the Redskins had advanced. But they couldn't get anybody else tickets. Well, not buy tickets. They could get free tickets just for them and another person. But, they didn't get the chance to have to give away multiple tickets like everyone else. And it definitely hurt a lot of those replacement players for a long time that they were the contributor to a Super Bowl winning team, and they didn't have the rings to show for it. But ultimately, in 2018, the Redskins replacement players were finally honored in the ceremony, and they finally got the Super Bowl rings that were long overdue to them. I had to put this Redskins team at number 1 due to the fact that not only they had a record-breaking, made history. Well, they made history a lot of ways in the Super Bowl. I just mentioned the most points being scored in a first half, but also it was historic for Doug Williams, as he was the first black quarterback to lead his team to a Super Bowl. Later on, it'll be quarterbacks like Russell Wilson, Pat Mahomes, and Jalen Hurts, who led their teams to Super Bowl titles. Also, Williams came from an HBCU. He went to Grambling State University. And Doug Williams, he faced a lot of heat heading into that Super Bowl. A reporter asked him, what was it like to be a black quarterback in the Super Bowl? What kind of dumbass question is that? You wouldn't have asked that to John Elway or Joe Montana or Phil Simms or Terry Bradshaw. Asked them what it's like to be a white quarterback in the Super Bowl. So why would that reporter ask him that? That was a very ignorant question. But also, the Redskins kept winning and finding ways to win. They won with their regular players. They also won with their replacement players. And the replacement players got some very key wins against some NFC East rivals. They went on the road, dominated the Giants, then went on the road to beat the Cowboys in comeback fashion. And it is messed up that those replacement players weren't acknowledged for a while. It seemed like they were forgot in the annals of Redskins / Commanders history. And in that 30 for 30 documentary, one of the replacement players said that even the guy who parked the cars and the girl who answered calls got Super Bowl rings, but they didn't. And even dudes like Doug Williams and Darryl Green even said that the replacement players should have gotten Super Bowl rings because they were on the team and they definitely contributed to the team winning that Super Bowl that season. And you got to give a shout out to Joe Gibbs, the head coach, as well as their GM, the late Bobby Bethard. I hope I said his name right. If I didn't, I apologize. As they put a pretty good team of replacement players together that led the Redskins to some huge wins for those few weeks. Also, this is one of the most interesting Super Bowl winning stories I have ever researched and also heard about. That a team could go on a strike, could follow their fellow players on a strike, and then bring in a bunch of guys off the street, make them a team, and have them win games. And then once the regulars come back, they really don't miss a beat. They end up winning. And led all the way to a Super Bowl title with a backup QB. And that's why I have the 1987 Redskins here at number 1. All right, that's more of my top 10 GOAT Super Bowl champions. Definitely hope you enjoyed the live streams the last 2 days. I'll be live later on today at 4:30 for my Super Bowl live stream as the Seahawks and Patriots are going to get it on in Super Bowl 60 out in the Bay Area. Let's see which team will walk away with the Lombardi. Now, if you would like to donate to the channel, you can donate through Cash App or PayPal. Here's the Cash App, # TalknnGrubb. Here's the PayPal email address, talknnggrubbing@gmail.com. Any donations you give to the channel, I greatly appreciate it. Definitely appreciate everyone who has supported the channel, past and present. Y'all have helped me keep this channel going, and I greatly appreciate it. All right, I got to get out of here. Thank y'all for joining me. Also, check out my top 10 Super Bowl halftime shows. That's up on the channel right now. That's up on the YouTube channel right now. Leave your comments in the chat whether you agree or disagree or how you felt about that performance. And also, let me know how you feel about these rankings. Definitely enjoyed doing these rankings. I had fun creating this list. And just appreciate all y'all tuning in. So, until later on, y'all have a good one. Love y'all to life. Salute. Y'all be safe. Enjoy the rest of your day. Have a great Super Bowl Sunday. Have a fun and safe Super Bowl Sunday if you're going out to any Super Bowl parties. And also, just be if you're going to drink, just be responsible. Do not do anything crazy. Do not try to drive home drunk, especially if you're up here in the Northeast in this weather. Make sure you got a designated driver on hand to take you home. I'm out. See y'all in a few hours.